Welcome everyone to Africam4Good, brought to you by explore.org. And thank you for joining us on this celebration of World Elephant Day, where we'll be having a little discussion on African elephants and their conservation. Today, I'm joined by the Venerable James Hendry, current editor-in-chief at Africa Geographic. It's a great pleasure to have him on the show today to discuss an animal I never tire of observing, the African elephant. Hi, James. Tell us a bit about yourself.
And thank you very much for having me. You want to know a bit about me. I'm the current editor of Africa Geographic magazine. I've been a field guide. I've been a habitat manager, a wildlife TV presenter, and an author. And now I'm writing articles and editing articles for Africa Geographic magazine.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure some of you out there would have seen James gallivanting on camera in the bush, which is, of course, something we have in common. Spending time in the bush, really important to us. But today, of course, the focus all on World Elephant Day and elephants themselves. But James, let's dive right into all of this. You know, as it's World Elephant Day, why are elephants so important to African ecosystems?
Well, I mean, I think they're so important because they're a keystone species and they're an architect of our ecosystems. And there's a lot of debate about whether there are too many or whether there are too few, and what the effect of having too many or not having any would be on our African ecosystems. But I think any serious person who's done a significant amount of reading will understand that elephants have shaped this continent, possibly not quite as much as human beings, but certainly as a close second to human beings. Their influence on African ecosystems over a much longer period than human beings have been around has been immense. And without them, I think our ecosystems would change into things that we wouldn't recognize. They'd be totally unrecognizable without the presence of elephants.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I spent some time up in Botswana now, as you know, and the areas at northern parts of Botswana, there's so many elephants, as we would judge numbers today. But as you say, 1,000 years ago, there were probably tenfold that number. And the ever changing question of conservation and how we go about managing those numbers, I agree, is such a difficult thing to understand. But they're such an important species. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more. In your opinion, what's the current conservation status of elephants, in Africa at the moment?
I think it's a very tricky one to answer, because in some areas they're obviously not particularly, their numbers are high. We look at areas like the Kruger National Park or in northern Botswana, where you've just been. Their localized populations are very healthy, either stable or growing, but in vast swathes of the African continent, some 70% apparently, according to research, of their potential range is unoccupied by elephants. And so, their historic range has shrunk enormously. And although some areas seem to have an excess of elephants, the species itself is still classified as endangered. And that's the savanna elephant, and of course their forest cousins, a separate species now, is critically endangered. So it's a difficult one to answer, and I think the greatest challenge that elephant conservation faces, it's the same challenge as most wildlife conservation in Africa faces today, is the interface of human beings and elephants. And that's not only rural communities, it is, rural communities and their interface with elephants is a massive, I'm not going to say problem, but challenge to elephant conservation, but also the presence of human beings and their slicing up and separating of elephant range just by their presence presents an enormous difficulty to elephant conservation. Because elephants can no longer move where they used to move. They can't move out of areas and leave them to rest for a while. And so I think those are the two biggest challenges that we face with elephant conservation.
Yeah, I think I've seen that as well, again, in the northern Botswana area, particularly around Chobe. That's human wildlife conflict, as you say, and the difficulty with the number of elephants in that region, considering, on the one side, on the Botswana side, we've got a wonderful conserved, protected area that's been protected for a number of years, but just across the other side of the river in Namibia, of course, a number of rural communities living on the edge, obviously, many of them subsistence farmers, agricultural focus, of course, and a big challenge for them, so I agree. I think that is going to be a big challenge going forward. And, again, coming back to elephants themselves, what is to you a common misconception about elephants?
Common misconception. I mean, I think there are any number, and I think that a lot of misconceptions on elephants are born of a lack of reading and understanding and access to accurate data about elephants. One of the great examples to me right now is the debate over whether there are too many elephants in places like northern Botswana or the Kruger National Park in South Africa. And most of the debate is being held by people who take their information from social media and then pontificate on social media, and they don't necessarily engage with people who have access to the data. And I think that's a real issue. I think also that as far as rural communities go, I think in parts of the West, there can be an impression that, rural people are unfair to elephants, and that the conflict that they have with elephants is born of human intolerance. And I think that's a massive misconception. And I think that people who care about elephant conservation need to take the time to educate themselves profoundly and keep up with the changing face of elephant conservation and the data that's coming out, and inform their opinions like that. And I mean, it's a little bit like trying to be a doctor. I think a lot of if you want to stay current in medicine, you've got to keep reading, and you've got to keep up with the latest developments and trends, and you have to change the way you do things. And I think a lot of the debates and a lot of the pontificating about elephant conservation comes from data that is very old, and in many cases outdated, and in many cases without scientific basis. And I think one of the big challenges is that elephant conservationists and people who are interested in elephants struggle to access and come to terms with new data that might inform new approaches. And, if you look at some of the guys who were involved in the culling of elephants, there are a few people who think that the elephant culling was a mistake, and there are a lot of others who were involved in it who don't think that it was a mistake. And one gets the impression, or I get the impression, that those that are reticent to say that it may have been a mistake are those who really would struggle to say, I was wrong, I made a mistake. And I think that as new research becomes available, we should take away blame, we take away finger pointing, and say, right, we've got new information now, let's move on to a new approach. And I think the Kruger's done quite well with that, and I think northern Botswana's done quite well with that. That makes sense.
I think so too. As you say, it's a really good point. I mean, the number of elephants in those areas has always been, the big question, and one of the most difficult areas to manage. But as you say, if you pick up a book as a guide and you're trying to get some information, as you say, updated information, it's not always easy to find, and sometimes it's very much in the scientific frame, and it can be overly complicated, or, in my opinion, sometimes overly focused on one aspect of the elephant itself, not so much the overall picture, which is difficult to portray to your guests when you're on the ground as a guide, and not always helpful, as you say, in creating a narrative about what we need to do to protect them.
I think a lot of language used around this stuff is utterly impenetrable to people who don't have PhDs. And, that's hopeless. because there are a lot of theses sitting on dusty shelves, rotting quietly in universities, that probably have some really interesting and accurate information, but it will never see the light of day because it is impenetrable and it's very difficult to access. And that's a pity.
Yeah, I think, as you say, interpretation of all of that information is key. And I think, safari guides, the rangers on the ground, people who are like us, often presenting this sort of information to a greater audience, that sort of translation into a more understandable language is quite important. So hopefully we can keep moving on that. Let's come back to us as a guide. What do you think is special about seeing elephants on safari? Why should we protect them?
I can't remember a time when I didn't have a guest or a viewer who spent time in close proximity with elephants that wasn't completely kind of touched by their presence. This is obviously in close proximity. So you get into the middle of a herd of elephants, they're totally relaxed around you. And to have that kind of experience around elephants provides a kind of connective experience with nature that very few animals seem to be able to recreate like an elephant can. And especially if that happens on foot. If you see an elephant on foot, it can be terrifying, inspiring, and connective all at the same time, without trying to provoke any kind of reaction from the elephants. And I think that's very important to state at the outset, is that any interaction that you do have with guests, obviously you want to have one that is calm, where the elephants are not unrelaxed at all. And if you can have an interaction like that and be close to them, where they just accept you into their presence, I've seldom had even the most sort of disconnected human being feels a sense of connection and calm, and they seem to imbibe the spirit of the elephants almost. I mean, I know it's a ridiculous thing to say, but they develop a sense of calm and joy from being around elephants. And I think that sort of connective experience with nature is hugely important, because it makes those people go back home. It makes them more conscious of their effects on the earth. It makes them more conscious of their effects on nature, and they'll go and tell their friends, you've got to go out to Africa and you've got to spend time with elephants. You won't believe this experience I had. I looked straight into the eyes of this elephant bull and he just walked straight past me, and I've never felt anything like that before in my life. And I think that's, those are important moments on safaris, and I think guests take a lot out of that, and I think they provide a lot for sort of ambassadorial experience, if you like. I think they bring a lot more people out here to experience nature and elephants.
Yeah, I agree, James. Safari without elephants just doesn't feel the same. I've had so many experiences myself where we've had, elephants all around the vehicle. The elephants are quietly eating away around us. And as you say, people just sit in silent awe, enjoying it. And it's there's really nothing quite like it. I mean, to be surrounded by animals of that size and everything's so quiet, but it just feels so magical. I've got many special moments, but for yourself, what has been your most memorable experience with elephants? And I suppose, what has been your most, well, if it could be called bad or frightening experience with elephants? We'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
My most memorable experience. Well, I guess my most memorable experience with an elephant was, we were broadcasting a live safari and we were on foot, and we were viewing a herd of elephants from a termite mound, and they didn't know where we were. The wind was good for us, and they didn't know we were there. And they were feeding at about, I don't know, say 30 meters away. And there were just three of us sitting on the termite mound quietly. We watched them, and they just moved slowly away from us. And as we turned around on the termite mound, a young bull came out of a drainage line just behind us. And young male mammals are fantastic to interact with, because they are not terrified to the extent that they just take off often, and they're inquisitive, but they're not aggressive at all. Well, I mean, obviously you get variations on this, but in this case, this elephant bull was very interested, unaggressive, and, you know, obviously he'd seen us. We'd had our backs turned to the drainage line. We heard him rustle, and he came up out of the drainage line. We turned, and kind of we all saw each other at the same time. And he was about 30 meters away, so he wasn't right on top of us by any stretch. So we just carried on sitting where we were on the termite mound, turned around and faced him. The rest of the herd had moved off, and he was obviously just following behind them slowly. And he lifted his head up, as elephants do when they become aware of people or potential danger, and gave us a little bit of a look. He didn't trumpet or shout at us, and then he put his head down again, and he just started feeding. So we sat on the termite mound and we waited. And he just came closer and closer and closer and closer and closer until he was probably about 10 meters away from us, just feeding. Didn't indicate any sense of alarm or fear or aggression. And we just sat there and waited. We couldn't really go anywhere. I mean, if we'd got up and moved, probably would have provoked a reaction, which would have been for him to just run away, I suspect. And we didn't want that, because it was such a kind of tight and conflict-free interaction with a wild animal. And we just sat there and waited, and he came, like I say, to within 5 or 10 meters of us on the termite mound, so we're slightly elevated. And he just fed for a while, and then he'd stop and look around the side of a bush at us and put his head back and carry on feeding, and then look around the other side and carry on feeding. And eventually he just lifted his trunk, smelt us, put it down again, and walked off. And I think that was, I've had a few interactions like that, but that was probably, I mean, certainly the one that sticks out in my mind. And it was, again, because it was just so connective. This wild animal led us into his space. There was no angst or conflict in the situation whatsoever. And that's what made it so special.
Awesome. Any bad ones that you are happy to discuss?
Bad ones. And I mean, normally a bad experience with elephants is caused by incompetence on the guide's part. Certainly in my case.
Mine too, don't worry.
Yeah, any conflict that I've had with elephants has been me being not aware, not reading their behavior correctly, and being unaware of my own inability to read their behavior, and then getting too close and invading their space. And I think, I'm just trying to think of a particularly nasty one. I remember once, you know, when I started guiding, it wasn't too long after the culling in the Kruger National Park ended. And so there were still quite a few elephants that remembered it and had experienced the culling, and they just didn't like people, full stop. And there was a herd of elephants on the banks of a river, and I drove down, 6 guests behind me, green as you like. I mean, I'd probably been guiding about 6 weeks. And we went down off-road, and they were feeding in the middle of the herd, middle of the river. And the tracker I was working with was very experienced, and he knew a lot of the animals individually because he'd been around for so long. And he saw an elephant with a tusk that bent down and round under her mouth, so she was very easily recognizable. And he looked at her, and he just started doing this to me, meaning back up. And she had done nothing by that stage. And then she looked up and saw us, and she just came straight out of the riverbed at us. And thankfully, he'd reacted fast enough, the tracker, to compensate for my slow reaction. And you'd never want to be reversing away from an elephant, obviously, because you can't see what's going on behind you, and your eyes get stuck totally in front of you. And we managed to turn around quickly and then race off. And she chased us down the road for a while. And it wasn't particularly close, but it certainly gave me the impression that it could have been a very nasty experience had she caught us. And thankfully, those experiences have been very few and far between. Mostly, I think, because, you know, I'm somebody who's, I think, like most human beings, quite afraid of personal trauma, you know, physical trauma. And so I tend to avoid situations that might end up in physical trauma.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I've also tried to stay on the right side of the big animals for most of my career. And as you say, when you're just starting out, even with all your training, sometimes you just forget and you get caught up in the moment with your guests. And yeah, it can be hairy. I have to say, my best experience with elephants happened not too long ago, also in northern Botswana, but I was happily sleeping away in my tent. I was hosting a group, but I was sleeping in the tent on my own. And in the middle of the night, I just heard this noise like Darth Vader had passed out next to my tent. And I woke up and looked out, and just around the corner, there was this massive elephant bull who had decided to sleep on a termite mound right next to my room. And that was it. He was there for the next 2.5 hours. Nothing you could do about it. So I took out a book and had a little read while he snored away for about 2.5 hours until he woke up and moved on. And like you say, that will stick with me forever. You know, it wasn't particularly engaging, but it just was magical. And just the slow, steady breath was, such a special memory. But thanks for sharing that with us, James. Awesome. We touched on a couple of places already, but if you had to choose, where would you recommend to go to see elephants in Africa, anywhere in Africa?
I think it depends what you want to get out of it. So, I mean, if you want great photographs, close-up photographs of elephants, then I guess a place like the Sabi Sands in South Africa is great, because the elephants there are so relaxed around people that, and they're still in an open system, relatively open system, and you can get pretty close and have an interaction that is conflict-free and get some amazing close-up photographs. It's not necessarily, I mean, I hope nobody will take offense at this, but it's not necessarily scenically the most amazing place in Africa. It's still beautiful. But if you want those classic shots, you know, somewhere in the Mara, for example, you're going to get amazing elephant shots with a background that, you know, will just explode the mind. Or maybe in Namibia, you know, along one of those ephemeral rivers, to find elephants feeding there. I guess, I mean, I've actually not been there. I'm going in October, but the elephant sightings in Mana Pools on foot and in vehicles apparently are absolutely spectacular. So I'll be able to report back on that later on.
Yeah, I've heard that as well, actually, in the Mana Pools area. I have been up there before, but I haven't had the wonderful on-foot experiences that you can get in that area. So you gotta let us know how that goes, James. Yeah, it's a special spot. And then if you were heading to Kruger Park, let's say, or a self-drive safari for the first time, what would your advice be to someone, you know, encountering elephants driving on your own?
My advice is that if you're inexperienced, and even if you are experienced, don't assume anything about the elephants that you're seeing. And if you at any stage feel vaguely uneasy, just increase distance. Just move away. There's no point in trying to stand down an upset elephant, thinking that you can read its behavior accurately enough to know that it's not going to push through an attack, or that it's not going to actually get physical with your vehicle. And so my advice is, just if you're in vague doubt, turn around and drive away, and just leave the human ego out of it. Now, this generally doesn't apply to women, who tend to be far less prone to bouts of ego attack. But, you know, men, I've met so many people who say, well, you need to just stand your ground, you know, and make it back, and we'll kind of show it who's boss. No, it is boss. If an elephant really wants to show you its boss, it's going to do that, and you are not going to win that interaction. So just decrease conflict by increasing distance. And so my advice is, if you feel uncomfortable at all, turn around, move away. There's no
Awesome.
honor lost in doing that.
No, stand down, as you say, stand down. And then lastly, you know, we've focused on a number of experiences in the wild with elephants and various aspects of seeing them in the wild. But of course, you know, today is all about conservation And, in your opinion, how can people watching this help with elephant conservation wherever they are?
I think the greatest task for anybody interested in conservation or elephant conservation is to become informed. I think it's beholden on us all to inform ourselves as much as possible, and then to be amazingly open-minded. And for me, one of the greatest things that I struggle with is this concept of hunting elephants. I find the idea of trophy hunting utterly abhorrent. I don't get it. I don't understand it. It makes me feel nauseous. But I have to force myself to understand why people do it. And I have to force myself to engage honestly with whether or not trophy hunting does perhaps benefit the greater concept of wildlife and elephant conservation. I'm not sure it does, but I have to force myself to be tremendously open-minded. And I think it's beholden on everybody on whatever side of that sort of divide you find yourself to be as open-minded as possible and listen to the different points of view. And then lastly, I think it's hugely important that we pay vast attention and pay a much greater attention to the interface of rural people and elephants, and focus our attentions on de-escalating that conflict and helping people and elephants live together, because people are not going anywhere. Our population in Africa is not showing any signs of slowing down just yet. And that just means that elephant-human conflict is going to increase unless we come up with innovative solutions and ideally non-lethal solutions to those problems. So I think that's where a lot of focus needs to be.
Awesome. Thank you for that, James. And thank you for your wonderful insights today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. Hopefully we'll see you again soon, and everyone can keep an eye out for you on various social media channels, I'm sure. Enjoy your time in Mana Pools whenever you're heading up there. And all the best for the rest of the year. We'll keep an eye out for some articles in Africa Geographic about all of these elephant insights. So thank you once again. Thanks everyone for joining us on Africam4Good. We'll be back again next week for some wonderful insights into conservation and African conservation. We hope to see you all again soon. Cheers for now.